everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a German Shepherd in acrylics. Now the first thing that I'm doing here is purely just mapping in my main lights and darks. So I start off with some black for the outside darker section and then I build up the iris from there. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is we can be versatile with the layering process. We can work light to dark or dark to light, but typically I'll work dark to light so that I can really build up my depth in stages. Now the one thing you're going to see throughout this tutorial is the use of glazes. Now I use glazes to adjust the colour of any aspect of my painting, and it works really well for also increasing the depth. Now I've got a video here on YouTube and it's all about glazing. I'm showing various examples of different paintings and the scenarios where I use glazes. So if that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now I will typically work with glazes for adjusting fur colour more for my mid layers. I have to first of all get a good base foundation in initially. So I'm using a couple of filbert brushes here and mapping in those main lights and darks. Now at this base layer stage we want to be avoiding any detail. We must be saving those for our later layers. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you know that I put a lot of emphasis on this base layer. This makes a big difference for the details that we're going to be adding later. Now one key aspect when painting realistic fur, regardless whether or not it's short fur or long fur, is the fur direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So we have to be making sure that every curve there we try to replicate that as accurately as we can. Now when we're working on a smaller scale, that can be trickier to get every single one of those changes in place, so it's important to pick the main ones, and that again is just going to help give a bit more of that three-dimensional look to the painting. For example, underneath the eye, you can see where I'm indicating that it curves over the eye socket and then attaches onto the cheek. All of these structures under the skin is what helps to build up shape and form within the painting. So again, it is something that I do focus on right from these very first layers. Now as I continue to layer here, add in more of my finer details, you'll notice that the colour is not what I'm focusing on. So I'll adjust that with the glazes, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. But all of my main focus here is just to build up the texture and reinforce the depth through working with those layers, and I build those up gradually. Now when I do adjust the colour, I do make sure that the layers underneath are completely dry. So when you are working with glazes, if you add that over the top of wet paint, it's going to mix in with that wet paint and that glaze is not going to be effective. So it's very important to make sure that whenever you're looking to use a glaze, regardless if it's to darken or lighten something or to adjust a colour, that you do make sure the painting underneath is dry. Now I don't really use glazes too much to lighten an area because you do want to be careful with the paints that you're using. You don't want to use too many opaque colours because you'll create a bit of a foggy effect. But this is something that I do cover thoroughly in my real-time tutorials on Patreon. But glazes for adjusting colours, as I am here throughout this process, works really well. One of the main reasons why I enjoy working with glazes like this is because it just allows us to focus on one thing at a time. We don't have to try to mix the exact colour as well as the lightness or darkness of that colour depending on the layer that we're painting. We can just focus on the values, so the lights and the darks, and building those up gradually with subtle mid-tones, building that depth as we go, and then once that's dry you can then adjust that colour with the use of a glaze. Now as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I do have a glazing tutorial here on YouTube and that will be all linked in the description below. Now onto the ears, and when I work on upright ears where you can see part of the skin at the back of the ear, I want to make sure that I paint that first. I want to try to ignore all of the fur that's sitting in front, because that is in front, we need to be leaving that for our later layers. Now I'm working on building up the initial texture here, so I've lengthened my brush strokes. They're significantly longer than the fur around the eye, and this is very important. Adjusting the brush length is going to help with that depth and replicate that fur texture accurately. Now there's three main things that I like to focus on when painting fur regarding the brush technique. The first is fur direction, then fur thickness, and then fur length. Now the thickness of the brush strokes is going to be determined by a couple of factors, but primarily it's how much pressure we're applying to the brush. Now if we use light pressure when using a round brush, you can actually create a very thin line. But if you apply more pressure, you're going to of course get a far thicker line. So it's just going to vary depending on the sort of fur that we are painting. Now the brush strokes, the direction of those brush strokes, that is key, as I said earlier, about following the structures underneath the skin, and here with the ear it's no exception. Although we don't have as much of that fur that's closer to the skin because this is longer, it's more overlapping some of those parts, it is still following like the centre of the ear where it starts to originate from the base of the skull. So all of this here is still important and helps to build up more of that realism. Now this right hand side, this ear was a little bit out of focus, so I'm also having to work with some softening techniques. Now because the acrylic paints, they dry quite quickly, blending can be more challenging. If that's something that you do struggle with, then this is an area that I do focus thoroughly in the step-by-step tutorials on Patreon. Now acrylics, you can get results very similar to oils as long as the techniques are correct. So there are many different things we can do to make that paint wetter for longer. We can slow that drying process down, but it really does help to make sure that we are thinking about that process to get the desired effect. And of course, the amount of blending that we're going to be doing is going to vary depending on how out of focus that section needs to be. Now the one thing I want to mention about that when we are blending acrylics is not to overblend. This can happen with any medium. We start to get confident with that blending technique and then we take it too far. So it's always worth just stopping, taking a look, having a bit of a breather, maybe step back from your easel and have a look at your painting at more of a realistic distance, 1 or 2 meters away, because we do have a tendency to lean into our painting when we're working on it, and that can make it a bit harder to judge exactly what that looks like. So always take that opportunity to step back because it does help us to visualize more accurately that painting as a whole. Now when I work on noses, the techniques really are the same. I'm building up my layers, I'm focusing on my lighting, but my contrast is always so important. That's one of my main priorities. You can see throughout this painting that I focused on getting my darks nice and dark, and I've also got my highlights nice and light. This is what's going to help build up that three-dimensional shape of the face. Now because noses do have that wetter appearance, they are going to be more reflective. So you can see here on this dog that the blue is very strong, and I wanted to make sure to capture that. So I want to be following the reference photo as closely as I can, noticing any colour changes and that light and dark variation. Now I can't stress enough that my priority when I work on any painting is my values. I don't want to worry so much about mixing the exact colour because as I've said throughout this, we can adjust all of that with a glaze. But if the base layers aren't dark enough, the highlights that we add on top are just not going to have the same impact. So it's very important to pay attention to the values. You'll see here that all of my base layer stages, regardless of the area that I'm working on, it's always a dark enough foundation. This is really important because if I start building up my highlights and I feel like they're not as visible as they should be, that's a very good indication that my base layer isn't dark enough. And what that does, if we don't start to adjust that and make it darker, the painting's going to have less contrast and therefore be flatter, less three-dimensional when finished. So this base layer process is so important. This is why I cover in so much depth the base layer process in my real-time tutorials. It is so important and it does make a big difference to how those brushstroke details look that are added on top. Now my main aim for this project was to show how much detail can be included in an 8x10 size painting. I wanted to show that we don't have to work on a larger scale in order to get a very detailed photorealistic painting. Now obviously the larger we work, the more space we have to add finer details, but it can be done on a smaller scale. We just have to get that balance right and the range of techniques correct. Now I do enjoy working on a larger scale because I can push the amount of detail that I can include. However, I also like to be able to get a project done within 4 or 5 days. Now if I work on something maybe that's a 16x24, I'm going to be spending weeks on that painting. So I'm not able to get the same number of tutorials done, I'm not able to get that excitement of planning the next project as often. So I do like to find that balance between working on a smaller painting and adding more detail through getting the techniques right, than always working on a larger scale to get those details and level of realism. It does just show that with the right techniques, we can create very, very detailed paintings when working on smaller sizes. Now, one thing that I'm really passionate about is if I make a mistake, I will always make sure to pinpoint exactly what that is in the real-time step-by-step tutorials. Mistakes happen and they are a great learning opportunity, so it's something that we shouldn't be afraid of. When we create a mistake, we need to work out how to fix it. Now, once we fix it, that's information that we will never lose, that we then can transfer to the next painting. So it's always such valuable information that we can take on to always be improving our painting skills. Now, in terms of the fur direction, this is something obviously that I do focus thoroughly on. I've mentioned it multiple times throughout this video. and I want to be making sure that if I do notice I've painted it wrong, just simply by moving my brush in the slightly wrong direction, or I may be given a bit too much of a curve to my brush strokes, that I want to be correcting that. Because as I said earlier, the fur direction, it follows that structure under the skin. So if I start to change that, I'm then going to change the shape of the face. So you see here that I painted over that section. I didn't panic, I just simply painted over it and then started the detail process in that area again. Now, although this takes an extra few minutes to get right, it certainly is worthwhile to do because it is going to help build up more of that accurate face shape. If we start to move that brush in a different direction and not replicate it as we should, then that face shape of that animal is going to change. Now, if you're working on pet portraits, that then would mean it's not going to look like that person's pet as much as it should. So obviously that would be a real issue. So if you do notice that you're going a little bit off with the fur direction, just stop, take a moment, make those changes and then move forward. Now, when it comes to working on the collar or harness of a painting, it's really important to think about the layering process. Now, the layering order here is what's determined whether or not I start the collar first or I start the neck first. Now, what I mean by that is, if I've got any sections of fur, if it's a slightly longer coated dog that is overlapping the collar, then I will paint the collar first. That therefore means that I've got that in place and then I can work over that collar if I need to paint in those realistic details. If I paint in my details, I'm then going to have to work around those and paint around those edges, and that potentially is going to make that fur look flatter and two-dimensional. So I do like to paint elements like this that are underneath first, and then I know I've got that in place. I just feel like it builds up a bit more of that natural flow within the painting. And when I start to build up the base layers for the fur here, you'll be able to see why that makes more sense. I'm going to start to put some of those brush strokes directly over the top of that collar. Now immediately, because I've painted that shadow, that darker red at the top of that collar, it already makes it look like that base layer of fur, which is very plain for the moment, but it already makes it look like it's casting a shadow onto the collar. And that's because I've painted the collar first. So I just prefer that. I think it does build up more of that three-dimensional effect in that painting. Now this is a really good base foundation. I've got a variation between my lights and my darks, but look how blended it is. I don't have any harsh start and stop points, apart from of course the areas on the collar where that sat on top of the fur. But as long as I'm making sure that my base layer is almost a little bit out of focus with that softness from one colour to the next, that's going to make it far easier for painting realistic details on top. Now when it comes to building up the details here, I personally like to work with 2 or 3 different brushes. I don't like to use the same brush for the base layer and use that same brush as I continue with my details. I might use some rounds, some filberts, some liner and rigger brushes, but the variety of brushes that I use are all for a purpose. I want to be making sure that I'm capturing that variety as I build up those layers. Now that variety can actually come from using the same brush but adjusting the technique. So it's not about having loads of different brushes. I might maybe only use 4 or 5 on a painting, but it's about how you use and adapt how you use that brush that can really transfer across through the different textures that we're looking to replicate. Now as I continue to put in this very first layer of detail, you'll notice that it's all with the same colour, so I'm not focusing at all on the exact colour for this stage, it's irrelevant, but I am focusing on the length of my brush strokes, the direction of my brush strokes and the thickness of my brush strokes. If I was to apply too much pressure to this brush, I'm going to end up creating one solid brush stroke that looks like a filbert brush. So there again, prime example that if that's what you want, you can certainly adapt the techniques on how you use that brush. But if it's not giving you the desired effect that that brush should, then that's an indication maybe that you don't have the paint versus water, the consistency of that mixture right. Maybe you're using too much pressure. Or even maybe you don't have enough paint loaded on the brush, maybe you have too much paint loaded on the brush. There are so many different factors that can influence what that brushstroke looks like. And again, that is something that I do cover thoroughly in all of my step-by-step real-time tutorials. Now for these finer details, this is where I'm using a rigger brush just to come in and put in those few hairs that are sitting on the very top. So this would therefore be the layer where it's your brightest highlights, and you do want to save those for the later stages. If these highlights are added in too soon, you're going to significantly limit the amount of depth that that area has. Now if a painting has a little bit more of a two-dimensional, flatter appearance, there's usually a couple of reasons for that. The first is that the contrast and therefore values isn't right, so the darks aren't dark enough, the highlights aren't bright enough. or it could also be that there's not enough layers that have been added. So if you work with a base foundation and then you only do 2 or 3 layers of details, that potentially is going to show as not enough depth. So the layering process and the contrast are 2 main factors that we do really want to focus on. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos here to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.